Féin to pipe in our platform party. Please give them a warm welcome. I think that was very stylish indeed. Welcome to our platform party. Some have travelled great distances to be with us this evening. Again, I want to thank you, the audience. If you weren't here, we couldn't have an evening like this. As I said, this is a night of celebration, a night of history. However, occasions like this do demand some formalities. I want to acknowledge the attendance of Deputy Joe O'Reilly, of Deputy Sean Conlon, of Deputy Heather Humphreys, of former Deputy Seymour Crawford, and a large number of colleagues on Cavan County Council, a number of colleagues who are members of local authorities in adjoining counties. You're all very welcome indeed. I did acknowledge at the outset the cross-political, indeed non-political nature of the attendance, and I think it's important that we proceed in the night in that spirit of remembrance and reverence of the late General Michael Collins and what we can all take from his fantastic legacy. In that context, in terms of what we can take from his legacy, I want to introduce a very good friend of mine, a young solicitor cutting a dash on the legal scene in Dublin, native of Tipperary, lover of all things GAA, someone with a passionate interest in the life of General Michael Collins, who attempts to emulate his memory and preserve his memory in all of his different facets, be it through his love of sport, be it through his involvement in politics, where he's a vice president of Fine Gael, and represents the voluntary wing of the party very well in that role, but most importantly, and in the context of tonight, as honorary secretary of the Collins 22 Society, a national movement whose aim is to preserve and to promote the memory of General Collins. And I suppose their greatest dream is that on the 100th anniversary of his tragic death, August 2022, that finally a statue of him will appear in our national parliament, a parliament that he works so hard to build up and preserve and defend. So in order to help you understand the mission statement of the Collins 22 Society, and it's important to note this is their event, I'm merely hosting it and chairing it, this is their event and their night, and hopefully we in this town and county can make a contribution towards the work going forward from tonight. But in order to give you an insight into the Collins 22 Society and to set the tone for the evening, I want to welcome my good friend, Gerry O'Connell.
Of Michael Collins. It's a great honour for me to be here representing the Collins 22 Society. The first thing that I'm struck with tonight is the massive attendance that's here. What we say in this society is that what we're asking the people of Ireland to do is to let Michael Collins back into their hearts and to show their support for his life's principles their fidelity towards his great memory, and a sense of allegiance to what Michael Collins stood for, and a sense of memory and commemoration and reverence for the great sacrifice that General Michael Collins made on behalf of Irish freedom and on behalf of the establishment of the Irish state. So for that, by your attendance in such huge numbers, I thank you all most sincerely for welcoming us here to Baileborough tonight. The Collins 22 Society was founded in 2002. It was founded on the site of the 1848 rebellion in Ballingarry in South Tipperary, the first place in Ireland where the tricolour was first flown in 1848 by the Young Irelander, the rebels that became known as the Young Irelanders. On that night, a group of people of all politics and none came together in Ballingarry with one mission. That mission was to perpetuate the life and life principles of General Michael Collins. And over the last 11 years, we have visited several communities across this country, across the United Kingdom, and we have sought to bring to those communities a sense of the importance of Collins, his significance, the importance of his legacy, but most of all, perhaps, to get people thinking about Collins once again, because it was our feeling, the people that came together to form this society, that we felt that over time, over the passage of time since 1922, his memory was beginning to become more and more distant. And there are a variety of reasons why that may have been. But over the last decade, we have seen a tremendous upsurge in interest in General Collins. And our society's work, essentially, is establishing history nights in different parts of the country where people can come and gather and take something from the Collins story. As Sean, your local councillor, said, we also have a mission to erect a statue, hopefully on the plinth outside Leinster House, before 2022 and the centenary of Collins' death. We feel, as a society, that Collins is the most significant figure in modern Irish history. But that is not to diminish the work of many, many figures throughout the revolutionary period on both sides of the Great Divide, which engulfed that revolutionary struggle from 1922 onwards. We feel his place is on the plinth outside Leinster House. He is of no less significance or no less importance to our people and our country and our nation than George Washington was to the people of the United States. And we feel that his rightful place should be in Leinster House, and we are campaigning nationally to make sure that his statue is erected before the centenary of his death. And I would ask all of you to join that campaign and support us in that struggle. We also look after, through our Dublin branch, the grave in Glasnevin, and I have to acknowledge as well the great support we receive from the Glasnevin Trust and from the Office of Public Works. There are fresh flowers placed on General Collins' grave at 11 o'clock every Saturday morning, and it has been the case that has happened on every Saturday morning since November 1945. We have a dedicated bunch of what I would call patriots, led by a man called Dennis Lenihan, who tended to Collins' grave for almost 50 years in a non-financial, not looking for any gain, just showing our reverence towards the great man. And that's part of the work that our society does. We also try and support the study of Collins by school children, through essay writing competitions, through talks to schools, because we feel that that is a really important part of our work, to ensure that the future generation, our children and our children's children, learn about the magnificence of Collins and learn and perhaps hopefully get inspired by his life principles. And tonight in Baileborough, I'm struck by the fact that the speakers that have gathered here tonight represent very many strands in Michael Collins' story. From Nora Owen, his blood relative and grandniece, from Michael McDowell, the former Minister for Justice. Collins was a member of the first provisional government of the Irish Free State and chairman of that provisional government for a period. to Aogan Farrell from Corla Ulla Cumann Lu Clasgael. Cumann Lu Clasgael was beloved of Michael Collins, and in particular the game of hurling. And he gave many years as a dedicated administrator for the GAA amongst the London Irish. Michael Doran tonight will speak to you and has spoken and has a particular area of expertise in the legacy of Michael Collins as Minister for Finance and the establishment of the Irish National Loan. And it's amazing how often history, current events hark back to previous times. The Irish National Loan was the great investment in the dream of a free Ireland by the Irish people. The 5 shillings and the 10 shillings and the tuppences that were gathered up at crossroads and creamery yards and hurling fields and estates all over the country in 1920 and 21. Every single contribution was independently verified and individually receipted, and Michael Doran has given particular study to that area. And also, it's great to welcome a great friend of the Collins 22 Society as well, Jim Higgins, a member of the European Parliament, because Collins had a world view. He had a view of Ireland developing in an autonomous sense. He had a view of developing our natural resources and our great natural industry and agriculture. And he was an internationalist. And that sense of him being a world figure that inspired others in the early 1920s and other struggles against the then British Empire is something that is significant and that we see recorded from time to time. And Jim represents the great tradition of the European Parliament, and Collins as an internationalist would no doubt have approved of Ireland taking its steps on the international stage. But to leave you with this, our great goal is the establishment of that statue, but it is also the establishment of the centrality of Collins in the hearts and minds of the Irish people right across this island, for 2 real reasons. Firstly, we believe that in Michael Collins' life and in Michael Collins' sacrifice, we see everything that is good about the human condition. Courage under fire, loyalty to comrades, unstinting and unswerving dedication to democracy, courage, physical courage, but also moral and mental courage, leadership, inspiration, youth, endeavour. Somebody who said, coined the famous phrase, that to govern is not to rule, but to govern is to serve and serve the people. And we believe in that whole panoply of what Michael Collins was made up of. There is everything to be proud of, and there is everything to embrace, and it's the very best of the human condition. But above all else, the second reason that we believe that Collins should be commemorated with as much fanfare as we can muster is that it is our belief that Michael Collins was the man who made democracy possible in this country, both by his sacrifice and by his civil, political and military career up to Baile Baileborough in August 1922. We feel that were it not for him, the great democratic project of a free Ireland would have foundered on the rocks. And for that, General Collins, we owe him a great debt. So I thank you all for your attendance here tonight. I invite you to listen to our great speakers, but above all else, wherever you go, when you leave the doors of this hotel tonight, keep the memory of Michael Collins close to your heart. If a flame has been kindled tonight in terms of learning something from the Collins story, keep that flame alight, and above all else, inspire the next generation. The next generation, your children, your grandchildren, or your grandchildren's children, to go out there and to learn about Collins and to seek inspiration from who was, without question in my view, Ireland's greatest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gerry, for getting us off to a great start, for sharing your vision and instilling us with your passion. It is now my great pleasure to invite up to address you a trailblazer for women in Irish politics in the late 70s, 80s and 90s. A woman who was a reforming Minister of Justice for our nation. a woman who the blood of Collins runs within her veins, the will of public service, the desire to be of public service runs in her veins, and in that of her sister, Mary Benotti, former member of the European Parliament. I think that resilience and bounce-back ability are important traits in any human being. She demonstrated that over the last 11 years by her newfound career in TV3 and presenting a number of shows there, in particular Mastermind. And I suppose she's going to challenge you all now to see how much of a Collins mastermind you are. She's going to share some of the more intimate and more family-orientated remembrances that she, of course, uniquely has. And we look forward to hearing more of that human side of General Collins. So, without further ado, I invite Nora Owen to address you.
Very much, Sean, and good evening, everybody. I'm really humbled by the size of the audience here tonight, and I have to say, as a grandniece of Michael Collins, as I go around the country, as I did when I was a politician, but even since then, the admiration and love of Michael Collins stretches way beyond what is automatically assumed to be the Fine Gael family, and people who were not on the pro-treaty side. Their family members will often come up and stop me and say, you know, we had great admiration for Michael Collins. They'd kind of whisper it. They'd be afraid in case one of their neighbours might hear them saying it, but nonetheless they wanted to share that information with me. And even in the Dáil, Fianna Fáil TD spoke to me as well about they remember their mother or their father talking about Collins, and they remember them talking about how they cried when he died. So I was just thinking that as a family member, it's a very humbling exercise to see the renewed interest and knowledge and love of what Michael Collins did for this country. And one of the first things I did when I became Minister for Justice, I went into the department, and I know some of the officials were all quite moved because I said, you know, I'm following in Michael Collins' footsteps because I'm in charge of the guards and some of the institutions of the state, and I put the statue of Michael Collins behind my desk, and you might wonder why I didn't put it on my desk. I put it slightly behind one shoulder so that when they were interviewing me from the front of the desk, the statue always had to appear, and if they went to the other side of me, I quickly got up and moved the statue to the other side. So I often used to say to some of them in the Irish Times, you owe me some commission, because I suspect I sold many of those. There was a lovely small bronze statue, and I put it there. But I felt, it sounds awfully corny in a way, but I felt this was, you know, my opportunity in a short space of time to just continue on some of the work he had done. And I suppose the most moving time when I was in politics with regard to Michael Collins, 2 times, Garret Fitzgerald appointed me to the New Ireland Forum back in '83. I was barely a wet week in the Dáil, like about 2 years, and those wonderful deputies that are here and the former deputies like Seymour and that know that you're still only learning after 2 years. And I went on the forum, the New Ireland Forum, and it was like a continuation of Collins's kind of work. He knew the work wasn't finished in bringing peace to the island, and so I was very fortunate to be there. But when I went as Minister for Justice to number 10, I remember standing outside the door with John Major and Dick Spring and John Bruton, and being very vividly reminded of the last member of my family that had stood outside that door. Collins arrived for the talks. There was no Prime Minister at the front door. There were no photographers. Lloyd George decided to meet the plenipotentiaries inside in the house. He didn't want to be photographed outside. And Collins had gone over on the night boat, gone to Mass before he got to number 10, and as it were almost snuck in the front door. We arrived in full panoply on the government jet, brought by limousine to the up number 10, up Downing Street and into number 10 with all the world's cameras there. And it was like, you know, plus ça change, as the French say, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Here was another set of Irish politicians coming to London to see what we could do to bring about peace in the country. So that was a very moving time for me. And just for a few minutes, I want to talk about Collins as a person. there are people here in this audience who are probably his age, or maybe a little bit younger or a little bit older. I know that Sean here behind me is almost the age that Collins was when he was killed. So when we talk about what he did for Ireland, just think about it as yourself, as a 30-year-old or a 25-year-old. Could you have done that for your country? And to think that he was dead and gone by the time he was 32, and you know, all his legacy that's there in the foundation of the state. But when he, as you probably know, his father was, which was quite common then, was 60 years of age when he got married, and he married a woman of 21, which is why he had lots of children. And fair dues to him, he was 74 when Michael Collins was born. So, you know, I see a few faces smiling down there. You don't know what's ahead of you. So Collins was only 7 years of age, but there was a huge bond between himself and his father. And his sisters and the family used to talk about how they remembered this little small boy walking the land with his father, because he was under 7, because he was 7 when his father died. And his father, somehow maybe he saw something in Collins that just he felt was special over and above even his other children, because on his deathbed he said, I shall not see Ireland free, but in my children's time it will come to pass. And he looked at the little boy and he said, take care of this little boy, he'll be a great man and he'll do great work for Ireland. Now, you know, how many of us would say that to our 7-year-olds and then see it come to pass? We all hope the best for our children, we hope they achieve something, but his father could never have known what this little boy was going to achieve and go on to achieve. And his sister, Mary Collins Pole, luckily, you see, so many people who have wonderful memories, we don't get them written down, we don't get them taped enough. But Michael's older sister, Mary Collins Pole, one of her grandchildren came home from school one day and said, my teacher today asked us who was Michael Collins, and I said, he was my granny's brother and he was killed. That's what she knew. And she said to her grandmother, you know, will you tell me the story? So Mary Collins Pole wrote down, I'm sure she had somebody type it for her, but she wrote down a wonderful history of that time. But a few of the things stand out about Collins, even as a very small child. One day, will I just get the right bit here? One day, my sister Hanny, whom I knew, and I were in charge of the baby. That was Michael, then able to crawl. We carpeted a loft with moss and planted daisies all over it. Unfortunately, there was a trapdoor, and presently the baby and the trapdoor disappeared. Our feelings may be imagined, and when we got through the kitchen without being given away, we took it as another proof of Michael's extra special qualities. He had fallen through the trapdoor down to the ground underneath, and just like a lot of babies, just shook himself and crawled away. But she also reminisced about the night he was born. She said, my mother carried the heaviest burden and at this time suffered greatly from pain in a broken ankle, which I suppose was never properly set. I remember the night before Michael was born, I was 9. I held the strainer while she poured the milk, and this may be a memory for many of you, while she poured the milk fresh from the cow, from very heavy pails into the pans for setting the cream. She moaned occasionally, and when I asked her was she sick, she said she had a toothache and would go to bed when the cakes were made for tomorrow. I was greatly troubled but said nothing, because in those days children were to be seen and not heard. The next morning there was the miracle of the baby. No doctor, no trained nurse, and mother and baby well and comfortable. To say that we loved this little baby would be an understatement. We simply adored him. So even in his very birth, the stoicism of his mother and the strength of his mother obviously came through to that baby. She did all the household chores whilst she was in her labour, and then went and had the baby whilst the children were all in bed, the rest of the children, and there was the baby the next morning. And just a third little story Mary reports in it. She said that the family were all gone out and she was told to have the potatoes ready for the dinner when they all came back. And she said from the time Michael could walk, he went with my father, in his quiet way told him how to become a man. She said, I suddenly realised that there were no potatoes ready. Having fed the calves, this is a 9-year-old now, having fed the calves, no, she was a little older then, and done other odd jobs, I went to the garden and found Michael had managed, he was 3, he had managed to dig a large bucketful. In later life, when I heard of infant prodigies playing the piano and composing music at 4, I wondered, could they dig potatoes as my small brother had done? And you know, it's a lovely story because I suppose it makes Michael Collins real. He was a little boy. He probably did bold things when he was a little boy, like all little boys do, but he also seemed to have a very charmed life and a wonderful family around him. And when he went to London, his 2 older sisters, Hanny and Katie, both minded him like mothers. And my grandfather, Johnny, was also very special to him in his life. And Johnny was, as some of you here are, a member of Cork County Council. But I used to ask my mother, we all did, I was one of 6 children, we used to ask our mother, did she remember Collins? And do you know something? She wouldn't talk about him all through our early life. We were well into our late teens before we could get her to open up, because it was a very difficult time, a very sad time for people. And she was 10 when Michael Collins was killed, and she had experienced, you know, the tragedy in a way of being related to Michael Collins, because she was in her own mother, my grandmother, had died, but before she died, the Black and Tans had arrived, the English forces had arrived to burn down my grandfather's house because he was Michael Collins' brother. And there was a young woman who was in charge of the children. There were 8 children in the house, and a dying woman upstairs. My grandmother was 38 and she was dying. And Peg came out, she was about 22 or 23, and she pleaded with them, please don't burn down this house. There's a dying woman upstairs, and these are all her little children, aged from 12 down to 12 months. And whatever humanity might have been around, the commanding officer left, and he said, we'll be back when she's dead. And 3 months later, back they came, and they set the house on fire. And I thought, if I just had a minute, I thought the best way to describe what happened to the house, remember 8 young children, and a force arrives. Michael Collins wrote a letter on the 1st of August 1921, and it's to a man called D. Hales in Genoa. And just to say what he said, Colonel Higginson, wait, I've typed out, it's easier to read it on this. Colonel Higginson, the commanding officer of Brigade of Cork City, ordered the destruction as an official reprisal for the attack on Rosscarbery Barracks. I'm going to slip through this. The enemy force came bringing with them several of the neighbouring civilians as hostages. Some of the civilians were forced at the point of a bayonet to bring hay and straw into the house. The hay and straw were sprinkled with petrol, and on arrival of the English forces, the house was then occupied by Peg, as I say, with the 8 children. It should also be explained that quite a short time prior to the burning, my grandmother had died. The English force hastened her untimely end. My brother, my grandfather, was at a county council meeting in Cork at the time of the burning. The little children were therefore without anyone to protect them. They proceeded to throw them out of the house, and having done this, proceeded with the burning. The dwelling house and every outhouse, with the exception of one stable, was completely destroyed. The hay shed, they even took the harnesses off the horses. The net result was the 8 children were left homeless, and there was no person or thing left. To complete the story, my brother himself was arrested on his arrival at the railway station at Clonakilty by other English forces about the same time as the house was burning, and he was taken straight to Spike Island. So these little children, whose mother had died a few months or a little bit earlier, were now homeless, and their father wasn't there either. He was now in Spike Island. And this was a letter Collins wrote to this man, and he said, he finished it up, which was rather full of pathos at the end. He said, this is what happened. He said, the above are the details. There were other minor points of brutality which cannot be fully told. The important thing is that the case was no exception. But what my mother remembers about that burning was, as I say, she was 10, and my Auntie Mary Pearce from Listowel was 12, and they were outside the front of the house, and she suddenly realised her school bag was in the house and her homework. and she tried to run back into the house. And I remember when she told us that story, we could feel her anxiety about going to school the next day and not having her homework. And she tried to run back into the house, but luckily somebody grabbed her and stopped her, so her school bag got burnt. Everything they owned got burnt. And then the family was divided up and sent around to different relatives around the country. The older children were sent to Ring, hence my mother had good Irish. And so various things happened to that family. But she remembers Collins coming back another time, because they moved into the stable that hadn't been burnt, and then another house was built. But she remembers him standing there saying, you know, what have I done to my family, my relatives? Because he was very conscious that his work for Ireland and the activities he got involved in were also putting members of his family in danger, and they were the kind of things that, you know, the family remembered. But I mean, Collins and what he did for Ireland, you know, he was an educated young man, but at the same time he seemed to have a kind of far-seeing image of what should happen in Ireland. And remember, there was no Google then. There was no, you know, probably the encyclopedia was the only source of information, and many of us grew up on those 12 books across the bookshelf that you looked up everything in. But he already knew about what was happening in Sweden and Denmark and all over the continent of Europe, about the kind of things that Ireland could do with the kind of facilities we had, improve our agricultural production, get an industrial base into Ireland, get good education going, get good housing, share whatever wealth was there with everybody. And imagine, you know, at that age, I know now some of the TDs are coming into the Dáil at 25 and 26, but it wasn't that common then, and he yet had this kind of fortuitous vision for outside of the house, so outside of the Dáil and everywhere. So I think that when I think of my opportunity to be in politics, I feel about this size compared to what Michael Collins did. But I feel greatly honoured that I was, as a family member, given an opportunity to follow in his footsteps in a way. And I mean, the old hackneyed phrase, you know, the hand of history on your shoulder or something. But there were moments when I kind of threw my eyes up to heaven and said, what'll I do? You know, just give me a little sign, tell me what's the next step. You know, we haven't reached a peaceful situation in Ireland. And then when I got to be involved in the talks in Northern Ireland, that was, I felt, Michael Collins said, you know, I've only kind of half the job done. I felt I was there sitting at the table in his place. So it was a great honour to see you all here tonight. And I'm going to just finish with one little story, because I tell this whenever I talk. Many of you I know, and thanks be to God there's been no scandal about it, love Clonakilty black pudding. But did you know that Clonakilty, there's no horse in it or anything, did you know that Michael Collins' grandmother was the inventor of Clonakilty black pudding? Joanna O'Brien, grandmother of Collins from Sam's Cross, she made her own black pudding, and the surplus that they didn't eat in the family, she brought to Philip Harrington's butchers in Clonakilty, and then it went down through the years to different butchers along the way. And it was marketed then as Lone Black Pudding. Michael would have been very familiar with the taste of it, and his grandmother would have had her own recipe, and as you know, the recipe is a complete secret. So sometimes when I'm having a taste of Clonakilty black pudding, I just sit there and reminisce and think, Michael Collins ate this black pudding and it must have made him great. So just remember that when you next have a bite of Clonakilty black pudding. It's gone terribly posh now. It's kind of on dinner menus now, you know, as starters and appetizers. But it was Joanna O'Brien who invented Clonakilty and got the recipe the way it is down through the years. So thank you very much for being here. It's a great honour to talk.
It's hard to know what to say about that or how to comment about that. That was a really wonderful, touching and personal insight, and very unique. And thank you a great deal, Nora, for coming here to Cavan tonight and joining us. And indeed for sharing your experiences nationwide too. This is only one of many places where you speak at a public forum such as this. I now want to welcome, and with no disrespect to the gentleman, perhaps not as well known in a public sense, but someone I think you'll find extremely interesting, Michael Doran, lecturer, His topic tonight will be the national loan that was raised during the time of independence, at a time when we were setting up our own parliament and our own institutions of the state, even before the treaty negotiations were concluded, when we were putting in place the policy of abstentionism that Arthur Griffith, a TD for East Cavan, had advocated for so many years. And like everything in life, that required money. And Michael Doran has made his life's work researching the national loan. And I suppose a lot of us think of Michael Collins looking well in that uniform, and indeed I think I used that picture on the posters and on the tickets and on the letters, etc. But it's also worthy of noting he was Minister for Finance, and hence why Brian Lenihan addressed Baile Baileborough on one occasion before his death. He was a Minister for Finance, and now we're going to hear more about that side of his life. So I introduce to you Michael Doran.
Thank you for that kind introduction, distinguished guests, distinguished audience. There are many characteristics to the story of Michael Collins, and as just been said, we don't picture him swaggering into as Minister for Finance, but in some ways as Minister for Finance he made one of the most essential building blocks of our republic, of our democracy. I'll just put the things into context. In 1918, Sinn Féin had won an astounding victory, a general election of 1918. They defied the British government and moved further to defy them even further by going to establish a new government. Most people in Britain and many in Ireland saw this as all talk, there would be no action. But Michael Collins would prove them wrong. Sinn Féin fought the general election of 1918 on the basis of self-determination, the idea that the people can determine their own future, that the eras of monarchies, of dictatorships, they're over. We're into a 20th century where the people will choose. Democracy by the people, for the people. And that was the essence of what Sinn Féin were offering the people in 1918. So in 1919, as they moved forward to set up with the government, they faced the practical problem how to operate that government. And Michael Collins, as Minister of Finance, came up with a novel way of solving their problems. First of all, if there were going to be an alternative government and set up representation around the country and try and organise an alternative government, many people expected Sinn Féin to fail. And this is when the nationalist, the Republican movement is broadly united in its goal. And the focus is trying to achieve the democratic will of the people. He faced practical problems. How could they finance the new state if they were going to be successful? They had to run the state to face costs which they couldn't face really. One was pay their representatives. So for example, the president was paid a salary of £500. The 7 ministers were paid a salary of £250. The TDs, they received no salary. Sorry. But they did receive expenses. Okay? So, thank God for that. Now, but they had to run all their operations, they had to get money. And they faced this practical problem where we were going to get the money from. Well, as a new government, to consider the idea of taxation, could they divert taxation from the British income tax? Well, they considered that really impractical. I can imagine Michael Collins looking down through the list of taxes, septic tank tax, household tax, property tax, and discarding them. But taxation wasn't practically possible. A very important principle which was considered but was rejected. Should the IRA be diverted from its main military duty into raising money, into basically robbing? But that was rejected for the idea that blurred into, well, terrorism and then almost anti-democratic. So the idea of a military campaign to exact funding was rejected. And that brought it to the idea then of involving the people. And the essence of Sinn Féin at this period was to involve the people in a Republican project to try and establish a new independent state. So Collins, as Minister for Finance, he proposed the idea of Republican bonds. And the idea was that the people should contribute, make a voluntary contribution to which it would be recorded, and then at a future date the people who donated would be reimbursed. And the idea was that it would show and prove to people in Ireland and internationally, and particularly in Britain, that this was not just a small group or a militant group trying to impose its will on the people. This was the people leading, and those in government and in the IRA were the representatives of that people. So in September 1919, Collins launched the national loan, the attempt to raise money from the people voluntarily. And Collins, his brilliant characteristics as an organiser, and this is what's often forgotten about. I mean, the popular image is Collins as the military man, as the great the director of the IRA during the War of Independence. But in terms of the long-term future of this nation, it's as Minister of Finance that his contribution is possibly could argue is more important. So beginning in September 1919, Collins is at the heart of this drive to get people to contribute to this new state. And you have to consider what it was in 1919, a difficult time for many people. It was a time of austerity for many people as well. And yet the idea was that people were going to make a contribution voluntarily to a project or an idea or an ideal that many people expected to fail. The great parliamentary party that had existed from the time of Parnell and Redmond from the 19th century, they used to hold national drives to raise funding. They considered it great if they received £10,000. So there, Sinn Féin were aiming for £250,000. So many people felt this would prove Sinn Féin was going to fail. Yes, they might win at the ballot box. Yes, the IRA might be achieving some success, but when it comes down to it, nuts and bolts, the people will not back it and will not pay and will not support it, because Sinn Féin and this Sinn Féin government is a straw man and will fall at the first wind. But in 1919, Collins directs it at every constituency around the country. He sets up committees to organise the collection of funding, and he personally keeps account of all the constituencies. So he then moves to try and publicise it. So he comes up with novel schemes to do it. He demanded that all over the country, spare walls, posters should be put up advertising the bonds, the Republican bonds. He even made a short film made by the New Irish Film Company for £600, which you can actually see Collins stamping some of the bonds. It's still, you'll see it available in some of the archives. National newspapers. Well, the national newspapers were warned that if they carried ads for anything like this, that they would be immediately shut down. So they went to the regional papers, and they placed ads which never mentioned the Republican bonds or never mentioned the Dáil or Sinn Féin, but you knew what you were contributing for. But most of the newspapers would have been shut down, but then were allowed to reopen. So gradually, it became very clear that money was starting to be collected, and the British government became very, very worried. And so within weeks of this, they moved to shut down this loan. They began a suppression of Sinn Féin. They tried to disrupt in all ways possible this national loan, but it had gathered momentum, and it was not going to be stopped. And people were donating all over the country. Well, donating might be the wrong word, but they were contributing to this idea, this vision. So it continues throughout 1919 into 1920. And despite all the efforts of the British government to stop it or halt it, their efforts to prevent it fail. So by the time you come to early 1920, Collins is very confident that enough money is being collected. But yes, the amount of money flowing in is much higher than they expected. Now, there are aspects to it that show Collins in all his wide range of gifts in this. But he was prepared to be ruthless. When the British government appointed the civil servant Alan Bell to try and find out where the funds were going to, the bank accounts, well, rather than allow him find out, he had him shot dead by the IRA in Dublin. So he could be quite ruthless in protecting this. But it still moves. The national loan continues and is not disrupted. So by the time it ends in the summer of 1920, in July 1920, they have collected the sum of £370,000. Now, you'd have to multiply that by about 100 to get the equivalent today in euros. So they've actually collected more money than they expected to gain. and they also expect money to come in from America as well. And in terms of the constituencies that were most successful, down in Munster and Cork, Limerick, they were among the most successful. And you'll be delighted to know that in Ulster, South Monaghan was actually the most successful of the Ulster counties in terms of contribution. But Collins had achieved an important principle. Sinn Féin government by 1920 was sustainable, and that meant it could continue. And the idea was created in 1919, 1920. The idea of the new state may have begun in 1913. The Irish Volunteers, the Acts of the Easter Rising may have been a huge step forward. The victory of Sinn Féin in 1918 was obviously a great step forward. But that national loan, the one that involved so many people, is really one of the essential building blocks of the democracy that Sinn Féin and Michael Collins, Eamon De Valera, and this is before the split, the bitter split that occurs, because this is a time when they were united on a common aim, and that's essential building block. That's the basis of a modern democracy. The people are involved. It's estimated 150,000 households contributed to this national loan, or to the Dáil bonds. So that's the essence, that's the important lesson of Michael Collins. It wasn't just from the barrel of the gun that freedom was won. In fact, the gun could have been defeated. The fact that so many people contributed to support this idea of a republic was the essential building block. And possibly Sinn Féin, the IRA of 1919-21 could have been defeated, because internationally around the world and in Ireland it became clear this is the will of the people, this is self-determination, this is democracy, this is the basis of what a state should be. And as one of the London papers described it, that the invisible republic, it exists in the hearts and minds of the people in a way that King George cannot command. And that's the basis of the democracy that we hold here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael, for sharing with us a very important part of the significant civilian legacy of the late General Michael Collins. We've arrived at a juncture which we're not used to here in Baileborough, where we're actually ahead of time. But anyway, we've arranged for a short interval and allow you to have a cup of tea and coffee, or something stronger, to mingle with the panel. And that'll go on for about 20 minutes or so, and I'd ask you please to respect that so we can keep the night running. 15, Nora, I hear Nora's like a mother here whispering in my ear. 15, 4:20. So if people can respect that, and we'll try and get back as soon as possible, just to give you a chance to mingle and chat with the panel and reflect on what you've heard so far. Thank you. Can I note, sorry, before we finish, and I see he's gone, but the machine is still working, I want to acknowledge the presence of Brian Daly from CavanTV.com. 100 countries around the world have members of our diaspora tuning in on CavanTV.com every day. They broadcast a range of programmes. I see Colm Colgan at the back, who is helping with the door. He presents a business show on CavanTV.com, and they do great work in covering a lot of events that are happening in this county so that our diaspora abroad can see what's happening at home. It's not going out live at the moment, but it will be available on their website in a few days, and I think they do a lot of that work on a voluntary basis, and I think they deserve a round of applause. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome one of our own to address this unique and large gathering. Aogan Farrell. And if the bar could please shut when those orders are complete as well. The fact that I didn't even get to do my introduction, that applause was spontaneous, I think speaks to, I'm still going to do my little bit of a speech anyway, I think it speaks to the affection and the pride that we in this county have for Aogan Farrell, someone who has recently retired as Ulster Council President of the GAA. He won't thank me for saying this, but I hope his story doesn't end there. And I'm sure there's enough people of different political views in the audience to read between the lines as to what I mean by that. I hope his story does not end there. We're not going to have a political night, but there was a lot of talk in this country for years about decentralisation. And if you go to Mudgebawn, you have a massive heritage centre, Aogan's achievement, personal achievement. You have a brilliant community centre, and every time I go there for meetings there seems to be a new bit added onto it and a new service available in it. And you have a primary school that would nearly suffice as a secondary school or a third level institute, such as its size. So any of those buildings could nearly house a government department in them in Mudgebawn, a very proud parish. Indeed, my colleague on the council, John O'Hare, is a native of there, and so I have to say nice things about it too. But I really am delighted that Aogan has come here with us. He gave a talk here 10 years ago where he himself and John Bruton had a showdown. John Bruton defending Redmondism, and as he can do quite eloquently, and I have a lot of respect for him, but Aogan Farrell equally defending his view of the struggle for Irish freedom. So he is going to speak about Michael Collins' views on partition, and I think obviously he will acknowledge the GAA story too, to some extent. I think it's important to note, that Aogan Farrell hails from Mudgebawn, the place for Arthur Griffith, and Arthur Griffith is often forgotten about. Michael Collins said he couldn't do what he did without Arthur Griffith. And Arthur Griffith's grandparents came from Mudgebawn, and that's why I insisted, when Bill, Martin and Jim Nevin wanted to bring this night to Baileborough, that Aogan Farrell would address us, and I now ask him to do so.
Gormai good Sean as na fokla jazz agus an curve living up. Ian a special the Corgi Gala League. Michael Collins and partition. Michael Collins, as you've heard already, and that's what I would say to you at the start, the complexity and the enormity of the challenges facing Collins in the period that I just want to speak about. You should never lose sight in the background that I want to look at Collins specifically in relation to partition, which was a primary focus of his in the last 6 months of his life. But never forget that in the background of all of that, he was setting up a government department, of which we heard earlier. He was also chairman of the provisional government. He was trying to deal with lawlessness. He was trying to deal with the international world. And of course, he was trying to deal with a split in his own army, a split in his own political party. So that was enough to tax anyone, but yet Collins was also dealing with the issue of partition. I specifically want to mention partition because it is often wrongly assumed by many people. Collins, that's the fella gave away the North. Collins, that's the man who signed up to partition. Sounds good, historically, absolutely inaccurate. Collins, of course, is a product of a very lethal and a very dangerous mix. A nationalist national teacher, the GAA, and a healthy mix of republicanism. And when you add all of those together, you can get a dangerous product. And that's what Michael Collins was a product of. His GAA involvement began in London. When you go to London today, there are great grounds at Ruislip. Once you go in the door at Ruislip, the big photograph that meets you first is a portrait of Michael Collins. Collins joined the GAA Geraldines Club. He was a secretary of the club at 19 years of age. He was noted as being a very efficient GAA administrator as well as a tidy hurler. And within a short time, he was elected treasurer of the GAA in London. Of course, he was noticed where all good people are. Young men and young women in Ireland to this day with any talent should always be noticed. And there's a man in London, of course, called Sam Maguire. Sam was the driving force behind the GAA in London, but also Sam Maguire was a member of what we call the IRB. Some people refer to it as Fenians, but anyone who was a member of it simply called it the organisation. And the organisation weren't as secretive or as elaborate as some people have made them out to be, but they were a small group of people who watched out for each other, watched out for others whom they saw could promote the cause, and the cause for them was an independent Ireland. But sometimes it's misunderstood. The IRB always saw itself as being subservient to the democratic will of the Irish people. And that's where Collins is sometimes misunderstood, because many people say, how could a man who was at the time president of the IRB sign up to the treaty? It's because Collins, as an IRB man, always saw the people as being paramount. So in London he joined the GA and the IRB, both of them. And through those links with Sam Maguire, which were to last forever, and of course that is the same Sam Maguire that is presented in Croke Park every September to the winning captain of the All-Ireland football team. And Sam Maguire, of course, was also, like Collins, a strong pro-treaty supporter and an IRB man and a GA man to his death. And the other man that was very influential in London was Liam McCarthy. Born in London, strong GA man, IRB man, and now the winner of the hurling All-Ireland in September receives the Liam McCarthy Cup. Collins told his immediate bosses in 1916 that he was going to the war. The British in the post office were so delighted to give him a month's salary. They thought he was going to fight in World War I. Of course, he came home to fight in the GPO. And I won't deal with the War of Independence because that's not the focus of what I'm to speak about. But at the time of the treaty, Collins always said that the treaty was a stepping stone. And when we examine the treaty debates, we find that the anti-treaty TDs spoke very little about the North. Very, very little. Almost all the speakers who even mentioned partition or mentioned the North were pro-treaty TDs. It wasn't an issue for anti-treaty TDs in Sinn Féin. Their issue was the oath. Their issue was an oath to a crown that they couldn't take. Collins pointed out to them that there was no oath to a crown, the oath was to the Free State Constitution. However, Collins was the one TD who spoke repeatedly in the treaty debates about the North. Where we see him at his best, and in the course of only this short address, we should only focus on his own words. Collins' first public meeting, where he addressed the whole issues of the North and partition, took place in Armagh on the 4th of September. The truce was in July 1921. All fighting had stopped. Negotiations were about to begin. Collins went to Armagh. Of course, he was their MP. He had been elected as MP for Armagh. The crowds were enormous in one paper, pitiful in another paper. In Unionist newspapers, the crowd was 7,000. In the Freeman's Journal, which wouldn't have been very strongly pro-Collins, the crowds were 50,000. Certainly folk memory would probably suggest a crowd in the region of 40,000, which was huge. Irish tricolours and American flags flew all around it. Cavan, Monaghan, Armagh, Sinn Féin, bands, marching in procession were all present. It was, by all accounts, a huge gathering. Many had expected Collins to deliver what was expected to be, some had suggested, a rabble-rousing, strong Republican speech. It was in parts, but it took most people by surprise. It was what you today would call a reconciliatory speech. He dealt with the issue of Ireland, he dealt with the notion of standing for a 32-county Ireland, and he spoke in the Irish language. But the main bulk of his speech was directed to what he called my northern friends, and by those he meant northern unionists. And he encouraged them to join with them in this new Ireland. He tried to point out that unionism was being bolstered by a British military presence, and that if they would deal with the new Ireland, that they would be in a better place. Now, Collins, his message didn't appear to have been listened to, because his car was stoned on the way out of Armagh as he drove through a unionist area, and one of his entourage, a man called Quigley from Monaghan, was shot dead. However, the speech is significant because it shows that in September 21, Collins was the first of the leadership of that movement to publicly acknowledge that there was another tradition on the island, a tradition that he himself did not belong to, but a tradition that needed to be worked with. I don't know what they did, but that evening Collins, Boland and others went to a town called Clones following the Armagh meeting, and in his own notes he said he got to bed at 5 a.m. The neighbours in Clones and the Diamond recalled hearing raucous cheering, raucous shouting, and boots being thrown out of a window. So we can only guess what was happening. But this was a very full of energy young man. And I just mentioned, since we're in Cavan, he did a tour of County Cavan the following day, ending up in a place in Cootehill called the Miss Blessings, where now Colm Smith has his dental surgery. And in that location held a meeting of the local circle of the IRB. The provisional government and the whole notion are building up the Ireland, beginning in the whole of January 1922. Northern partition was top of Collins's agenda. The Ulster football final, January, doesn't sound right. But then, don't forget, Collins's links with the GA and the IRB were never far away. And the secretary of the Ulster GA Council at the time was a man called Owen O'Duffy. Owen O'Duffy arranged that the Ulster football final would be played in Derry in January 1922. Strange location, you would say, for an Ulster final, and a strange month. But the reason was because Collins had 3 close friends in jail in Derry and he wanted them out. And his close associate was a man called Dan Hogan. Dan Hogan was the commander of the 5th Northern Division of the IRA, and Dan Hogan was a brother of Michael Hogan, who was shot in Croke Park on Bloody Sunday, after whom the Hogan stand is named. Dan Hogan decided that he would play for Monaghan. He hadn't been playing for Monaghan that often, but he decided he volunteered to play for them on that particular day. So Dan Hogan and the Monaghan team headed off for Derry, but they were carrying arms, they were stopped, they were arrested, they were imprisoned. So the Derry jailbreak didn't happen. But I'm telling you this little story to show you how Michael Collins really got down and worked all the time dealing with issues within what we call the 6-county area. Collins wrote to Craig and he ordered Craig, strange way to use of language, but he ordered Craig to release the GA men promptly. Craig wrote back and told him that if Hogan and his friends applied for bail, that he would release them. Collins refused. He wouldn't ask them to apply for bail because Collins didn't recognise the 6-county state. Officially then, O'Duffy and others decided that they would have a better plan. So in a memo that we have in the Public Records Office, and remember Collins at this stage is chairman of a new government, he's setting up a free state and he's telling the world that he's doing his best to deal with the Irish problem, as it was still called, as best he could. But in a memo from O'Duffy to Collins, O'Duffy wrote, "We have arranged the kidnappings as discussed. Unless I hear from you by 6 o'clock tomorrow evening, we will proceed." So clearly Collins was implicated with O'Duffy in kidnappings to try to force the release of the Monaghan GA football team. And the kidnappings happened. And the kidnappings went ahead on the night of the 7th of 8th of February, when what was later to be called the Free State Army, but at this stage was simply be called the National Army, sent a force of about 200 men into the Tyrone Fermanagh area, and 45 prominent Orange men stroke unionists were kidnapped. The whole operation was coordinated from Clones. O'Duffy was in charge. Sean Boylan from Meath, father of the famous Meath GA trainer Sean Boylan, was in charge of getting the hostages away from the area, and he set up his headquarters at Cootehill. And Sean McGowan set up his headquarters over in Leitrim to move in that direction some of the hostages. So 42 men, which was a huge invasion, as it was called in the House of Commons, of territory occurred. Collins publicly said that he knew nothing about it, but he added in public that he would do everything possible to ensure the safety of these unfortunate captured men. And he promised that his government would see to it that they would have the best of attention given to them, and he hoped that they would secure an early release. Collins, of course, was fully aware of what was happening, but the kidnapping of the Orange Unionist men led to a huge build-up of the new force known as the Specials. Many of you would have known them or heard of them as the B Specials. Recently had been founded to protect the new northern state. At this stage there were A Specials, B Specials and B Specials. And their total numbers were 48,000. The Specials were built up along the whole 6-county border area, and as you might say, the situation was tense. And then matters got gravely worse, because on the 11th of February, only 3 days after the kidnappings, at Clonus Station, a train on its way from Belfast to Enniskillen had to travel through Clonus. It stopped at Clonus, and on the train, in uniform, were 20 Specials, armed and on their way to help defend what they saw as their state following the kidnappings which O'Duffy and Collins had coordinated. Word was sent to the local National Army commandant. His name was Matt Fitzpatrick. Fitzpatrick decided that he would like to speak to the Specials, so he went immediately to the station in Clones. When he arrived in Clones, the train was about to move off. Lieutenant Peter Rooney, who was from Newbliss, he went to the train driver and he persuaded him that it would be better not to move the train. Matt Fitzpatrick decided he would like to interview the sergeant in charge of the B Specials. He went to the carriage that they were located in, and two versions of events happened. Who fired first? But for the purpose of tonight, it doesn't matter who fired first, but Matt Fitzpatrick was shot dead, and he was the first officer killed in the new National Army. As soon as Matt Fitzpatrick was killed, there was, of course, as you can imagine, panic. Many more members of IRA/National Army rushed to the area, and fighting broke out between the specials on the train and the army, who were now coming into the station from all locations. But only one gunner is of interest to us tonight, a man called John McGonnell. He retired as a Free State Army colonel in 1948. But McGonnell was holding one of the brand new Thompson submachine guns, which Collins had arranged through the IRB to come from the United States. The Thompson Ordnance Company was backed and funded by a very wealthy American millionaire who had also very strong IRB connections. And through all of those links, these new guns, Thompson machine guns, were smuggled. 500 of them were detained, but 150 of them did arrive in Ireland, and one of them was in Matt Fitzpatrick's possession. He used the Thompson machine gun, and it had tragic circumstances. There was a massive amount of fire and a massive amount of damage. 5 specials were killed, and the rest of them were all maimed and wounded, and 3 of them died within a few years after that incident. As you can imagine, this led to huge diplomatic problems. Winston Churchill was chairman of the Irish Dublin Committee at the House of Commons, and he announced that immediately the British government were halting British troop evacuations from the south. So the whole treaty was about to collapse, and we were still only in February of 1922. The treaty had been approved in December, but the British already had second thoughts, and they halted all troop withdrawals. It looked like troops from the British would come back into the 26 county area. Craig and other unionists encouraged them to do so. Collins showed a master stroke again of diplomacy, and he went to London. He visited Churchill, he visited Lloyd George, and he convinced them that not to reinvade Ireland, that he would see to it that the Orange men who had been captured as hostages would be released, and he persuaded them to not reinvade. On the 21st of February, the Monaghan GA hostages, Hogan, etc., they were all released. And the following day, on the 22nd of February, the first of the Orange hostages, 26 of them, were released. The remainder were not released until the 27th of February. None of them had been harmed, none of them were injured, and all of them were released unharmed. By the 14th of March, again, and it's only specifically partition I'm speaking about, and don't forget all of these other issues were going on in the background, trying to stop the split, which was clearly happening within the IRA, and particularly trying to prevent the split with De Valera within the Sinn Féin party. On the 14th of March, Sir Henry Wilson was appointed as the advisor to the new specials and the RIC in Belfast, and he brought with him a strong military career, and Collins instantly was not a fan, and he wrote to Churchill that that damned man need to be brought out of Ireland immediately, or my men will see to it that he leaves in a hurry. You can only guess as to what he meant by that, but it certainly was threatening language. Some historians suggest that Collins at this stage set up what became known as the Ulster Council or the Northern Military Council. Neither of those, in my opinion, are quite correct. What merely Collins was doing was he was using the IRB, because he brought together again Sean McKeown, Sean Boylan, Ono Duffy, and located again in Clones, he decided that he would coordinate a stronger resistance to the emerging 6-county state. So he decided that he would supply weapons, that no longer was it possible for him to send troops from the new National Army into the 6-county area. However, he decided he would arm the IRA units within the 6-county area. So the guns were procured, and the guns were brought to Cootehill, and from Cootehill they were brought to Clones, and from Clones they were made ready to go north, when at the last moment Collins sent a memo directly to Ono Duffy to stop, because if the guns were found they'd be traceable back to Collins and the treaty would collapse. So he arranged through the IRB with Liam Lynch, IRA commander in the south, anti-treaty, but at this stage also, don't forget, a member of the Supreme Council of the IRB. And through his IRB friendship with Liam Lynch, he arranged a swap. And the IRA guns were swapped from Clonus with the guns of Liam Lynch. The idea being that Liam Lynch's guns could be linked back to the anti-treaty side. So this happened, and Collins's guns, Free State guns, were sent north to arm and to help defend. I should say in all of this, the biggest tragedy in all of it was that following the casualties at Clonus and the casualties everywhere, which are all in themselves tragic, Belfast and Belfast innocent civilians suffered most, because within a 1 month period after the Clonus incident, 58 people in Belfast were shot dead. Normally in what you now become known as pogroms, these were innocent people who were either in the wrong place at the wrong time, or whom somebody decided they simply did not like the tradition they came from. And all of this weighed very heavily on Collins. Collins decided by May in public statements that he could not let the six-county area develop as a state, but however militarily. He spoke with the IRB. He did not want any longer to see that they couldn't defeat it militarily. So publicly he was now moving to a position of appeasement. However, in May, at a meeting of the IRB again in Clonus, it was decided that they would have one more military go. So they arranged once again that in the month of May 1922, various police, RIC barracks would be attacked, and this happened right across the six-county area. Again, it led to many deaths, again it led to many pogroms, but it also, on the other hand, led to an increase in the specials, and it led to an increase in British Army presence, and the army was increased from 5,000 back up to 9,000. And then, probably the last straw from a military point of view, that lovely little village of, some of you know it, Petticoat and Baile, on the border area, there was an incident on the 3rd of June where 3 specials were shot, again by Collins's National Army men, not by anti-treaty or pro-treaty IRA men, but by National Army troops as they were called at this time. And the response was swift, and it was heavy, and it was strong. 1,000, and those of you who know the village of Petticoat, 1,000 British soldiers on the 3rd of June moved into the village, and 4 of the National Army members who on the southern side of the border were shot dead, and the 1,000 troops were clearly heavily armed, and it became clear that the Free State or the National Army making an armed attack into the north was no longer going to be viable. Collins wrote in his diaries that from that moment in June he decided it would have to be peaceful obstruction. So on the 3rd of June there was a meeting of the Provisional Government of which he was chairman, and the minutes show us that they unanimously passed that they would now face the situation in the 6th county through peaceful obstruction, and that no troops from the 26th would enter the 6th county area. The British sent over a colonel called Colonel Talents to inquire and to look into the situation, how it was developing and who was doing what to upset or to support the treaty. Talent's report, like many good political reports, was never published. It was buried because, like George said, this is dynamite. So nobody knew anything about it until the 30-year rule, and historians were only able to access it a few years ago. And when you read it, it's quite amazing, because Talent said, "I have absolutely no doubt that Michael Collins, chairman of the Provisional Government, works hand in glove with the IRA in the north to destabilise the north." Talents also said, "The specials are disgusting. They are the worst police force anywhere in the world and should be disbanded immediately." And Talents then further went on, Dawson Bates, he was the new Northern Ireland Minister for Home Affairs in charge of policing, and Colonel Talents said, "Dawson Bates is a disastrous minister and should be removed forthwith. The man is a bigot and has absolutely no understanding of humanity." Needless to say, as I said, that report was dynamite and it was buried. Collins, at a meeting then with the IRB, was acknowledging that everything was to change. And I'm nearly finished, Chairman. One of the most contentious issues then was on the 26th of June 1922. The advisor to the new 6-county state that I mentioned earlier, Sir Henry Wilson, was shot dead on his doorstep. Historians are not sure to this day. You have historians like Tim Pat Coogan who will show proof that he was shot on the orders of Michael Collins. Most historians would now tend to support that view, and I know Diarmaid Ferriter also does. However, other historians like Peter Hart will also say that whilst it's likely Collins may have ordered his assassination. There is absolutely no proof that it happened. What is sure is, though, it was two of Collins's GA friends from London, Reggie Dunn and Joe O'Sullivan, two members of the Hibernian GA club, who did carry out the shooting. That sent the British government in absolute shock. Michael Collins denied any involvement in it, and it was widely condemned on all sides. However, on the 23rd of July, Collins wrote to Cosgrave, who was to succeed him only a short month later. I don't know how we're ever going to deal with the northeast of Ireland, but I know one thing. If De Valera and his friends continue in the split, the northeast will be lost forever. We have to still strive for unity. So Collins at all times was showing he wanted to avoid a split, and the main reason he wanted to avoid a split was because of the six-county area, which he held very dearly to his heart. Unfortunately for Collins, and I would argue unfortunately for Europe, July-August civil war did begin, and Collins was, even at the start of the civil war, on the day after the shelling commenced against the anti-treaty IRA, Collins was still writing memos to Churchill protesting about the fact that the new six-county state would not allow PR in their elections, which was a key condition of the treaty, but was being clearly broken by the six-county state. Because the Civil War began, Collins's main men had to be pulled away from their northern areas. So Duffy, for example, was sent to Limerick and McKiernan to the west. And then within the six-county area, which is also important to state historically, there was no civil war. The six-county, and many people who don't particularly delve into the history too deeply find this surprising, but it is a fact. The vast majority of the six-county IRA were strongly pro-Collins, pro-treaty. 500 of the Northern IRA came south and joined the Free State Army. Seamus Woods, the OC of the Belfast Command, became a colonel. And in a memo to Cavan O'Shields, as the garrison, as the shelling continued in the forecourts, again he wrote, similar to what he had written to Cosgrave, I fear that a war among ourselves, which is now beginning, will shatter any hope we ever have of unity with our friends in the northeast. So even at the height of a split, Collins's preoccupation and his show was still with the northeast. And so I would just say to you that Michael Collins, the complex character that is often mentioned about in many different ways, when he was shot on the 22nd of August 1922, as Nora Owen has clearly showed, the biggest losers were undoubtedly his family, because those who were close to him, they were robbed of a very important, young, vibrant, energetic member of the family. And many historians then argue that Ireland, the Department of Finance, the army, lost what could have been a great leader. I would contend strongly that those who lost most when Collins was shot, apart from his family, were the Northern Nationalists. Because when Collins died, they had no champion and they became second-class citizens for the next 80 years. Gura mai agah.
Thank you very much, Aogan, for giving us a perspective that is very unique to our native province and to our region. Thank you very much again. Now, with no disrespect to the rest of the panel, I think we have a particularly interesting act up next. And so his act would imply maybe insincerity. I think even if you don't agree with his political views, you will all agree that Michael and I apologise, I kind of don't know whether to say McDowell or McDougall, is a man of great conviction and very clear principle, and that informs everything he says. And we mightn't agree with them, but at least he has them. And I think that's important at a time when a lot of public debate can be very fuzzy, can be led by opinion polls, and can be led by populism. He's someone, you know, a lot of people ask me for advice with CVs and going for jobs and that, and one of the big problems is that they don't have enough experience on the CV. We can say that about Michael McDowell, senior counsel, TD, Minister of Justice, former Taoiseach. The list goes on in terms of achievements. I suppose, why is he here tonight? I think a lot of us were deeply impressed when he did a documentary, I think it's about 2 years ago now, on Ireland's Greatest. And his very clear contention, which he argued with great style in a documentary, was that Michael Collins was Ireland's greatest, that he was our George Washington. And I think we all agree with that statement, or we wouldn't be here tonight. And I now invite Michael McDowell, the grandson, or is it the great-grandson or the great-grandson of the man who cancelled the Rising, to address us on Michael Collins, the Republican.
Michael Collins 22 Club for inviting me here this evening. The honour is all mine. I was, as has been said, very pleased to have been asked to present to the Irish people a couple of years ago a programme, the purpose of which was to say that Michael Collins was Ireland's greatest. It was a programme that I wanted to do because I believed passionately that that was a true bill, that he was the man who brought about Irish independence, that he above all was head and shoulders in many respects over all of the contemporary generation of patriots, men and women, who in their various different ways and on different sides, as it turned out in the end, made huge sacrifices to bring about an independent Ireland. I'm one of these people who believes very, very strongly in an independent Ireland. I believe that, especially now in the financial crisis and the aftermath of it, when the very project of an independent Ireland was at issue, we should, as a generation, derive huge inspiration from the courage, the conviction of Michael Collins. You know, I was listening to Aogan there, and there are many people, particularly Fine Gael people, to whom some of the things he said would come as news. And that's one of the great advantages of having an occasion of this kind, that you know, the Civil War split in contemporary Irish politics tends to make us think in terms of our past history in a way which is distorted by present party political interests. It isn't the case that Michael Collins was of the same political wood as, say, John Bruton. And John Bruton very candidly said so on many occasions. He was a Redmondite, and I'm not denigrating Redmondism at all. But Michael Collins was emphatically not cut from that timber. Michael Collins, as I discovered in researching that programme, was a man who, for instance, disapproved of Daniel O'Connell, a person for whom the nation now would have huge time. Michael Collins was a Republican through and through. As Aogan said, he joined the IRB as the secretary and the treasurer of the GAA in London, in a hall in East London, and I remember standing in it, it's now an antique shop, and just thinking of the scene that he was sworn into the IRB by Sam Maguire at a young age. He was in the GPO in 1916, as was W.T. Cosgrave and Desmond Fitzgerald. So people who tend to think of Irish politics in retrospect as something in which the divisions we now see were reflected back to those times are wholly wrong. These people believed in the tricolour, they believed in the Republic, they believed absolutely in the rightness of what they were doing. And you know, sometimes now we tend to revise our history and to airbrush aspects of our historical figures out of the photograph of history that we like to think of, and to deny the attributes of people or just ignore the attributes of people which don't suit our present world view. And I am very strongly of the view, and I tried to get it across in that programme, that Michael Collins was a Republican. And when he signed the treaty, when I did that programme and Nora was talking about the personal aspects of it, I had to walk in his footsteps all around Ireland. I had to stand in the ruins of the house down in West Cork near Skibbereen. I had to look at the family homestead to which the family moved after those events. I had to visit the National Museum and hold his death mask in my hands. I had the privilege of going to the National Archive and seeing and holding in my hands the original treaty on which his and Churchill's and other Lloyd George's signature was on it. And then to look at the minutes he kept of the GAA club that he was involved in London, the Geraldines, the records he kept of their pretty awful performance in local leagues, the people who didn't turn up for matches, the loss of monies, the light-fingered treasurers who pocketed a few of their funds on occasion. All of these things brought to you a very rich and colourful and passionate young man. And it was that man who went to the GPO in 1916, having opted out of the post office service in London, where his sister Hannah had got him a job. It was that young man who was interned after 1916, but he was disappointed and slightly let down by the incompetence of the people who were the leaders in 1916 in his own head, and he made up his mind that his sacrifice and what he had done would not be in vain. And he galvanized the whole separatist movement and organised for it as a member of the IRB. And he was the driving force, really, in confronting and defeating the British forces in Ireland. He was also, as has been pointed out here, a Democrat. He organised the national movement to contest elections. And they obtained, as they saw it, a mandate through the Sinn Féin party in the 1918 election for an independent Ireland and for the establishment of a republic. And on foot of that, he prosecuted the War of Independence with incredible braveness, with incredible courage, with such a clear vision of what could and could not be done. And he was surrounded then by people who were sometimes more eloquent than he, sometimes less reasonable than he. And even in the military campaign of the IRA against the British, he felt let down by events such as the burning of the Custom House in Dublin, where upwards of 100 volunteers were captured. He had to hold back schemes of that kind, where his volunteers would be expended to make political points. He had to deal with people like Cathal Brugha, who he thought were unrealistic, and he had at the same time to deal with a huge effort by British intelligence to track him down, to compromise him, and in the end, if they could, to take his life. And when he went to London, and this is the crucial thing about him, when he went to London, he knew exactly what he was taking on. Let's remember this. The British Empire, as it saw itself, though we now know the seeds of its destruction were already put in place by the whole process of the First World War, but the British Empire thought it had won that war. And the idea, and Collins knew this absolutely, there was one thing that could not be conceded in London by the British establishment, and that was the word republic. And the reason it couldn't be conceded was that it would involve effectively tearing up the result of the Boer War in South Africa, and it would involve handing to Indian separatists the prospect of end of empire. And when you were dealing with, and let's remember, now the United Kingdom is a shadow of its former self, this was the largest empire on the planet. When you were dealing with that planet, you could not expect them, in all reason, to actually write a suicide note for the empire. And he knew that he had to achieve, as an Irish Republican, as a member of the IRB, the absolute maximum that he could achieve for this state, and that he should not burn the opportunity like a moth to the candle of going too far on foot of an ideological view and destroying the opportunity that had been created by the War of Independence. I just ask you to think of the treaty for a second, because as I held it in my hand in preparing that programme, many of its attributes really came back to my mind. This was creating a sovereign, independent Irish state with its own army, its capacity to have its own international relations. That was what was on offer. It was also a state in which the people of Ireland were being given the right to determine their own constitution and also to change that constitution in future, although for various reasons during the Civil War the supremacy of the people was swept aside and Parliament kept the right to change the constitution without reference to them, which led to further disasters. Even the name Saoirstát Éireann, Free State, as it's translated into English, was the name that the Dáil Éireann in 1918 had selected as the Irish translation of the word Irish Republic. And Saoirstát Éireann was, if you look at the minutes of Dáil Éireann in 1918, the Irish version of the Declaration of Irish Independence and the validation of the 1916 Republic referred to the state as Saoirstát Éireann. And just remember this, the state had its flag, it had its army. The head of the government was called the President of the Executive Council. These were all the trappings, insofar as Collins could deliver, of Republican government in the Irish state. So those who have glibly in the past said that he somehow abandoned the idea of a republic are so wrong. And the other thing I thought about all of this was he told the people honestly, this is not what we believe is the ideal or perfect outcome. But it is the freedom, as we all know, the phrase he used, the freedom to achieve freedom. This is the foundation on which the Irish Republic will become in form and in outer shape a republic in due course. That was his message. And it wasn't an easy message, especially in view of the ideologues who said, you are letting down the republic. He said, I'm delivering a republic. Okay, we're in the Commonwealth, but that just has to be. We cannot secede for the Commonwealth for the reasons that I mentioned earlier a few moments ago. So Collins must be understood as a Republican. And as Aogan has said, and as I have intended in my notes here to deal with, but I won't repeat them now, he remained the head of the IRB's Supreme Council. He remained the IRB man, and it's true, it's absolutely true, that the IRB in general, and there were some exceptions, the IRB as an organisation backed Michael Collins, particularly its northern membership backed Michael Collins at the time of the treaty. Now, Aogan has pointed out that Collins was not a partitionist at heart, and probably he was, of all the people who were involved in the Civil War, perhaps with the exception of Frank Aiken, he was probably the most anti-partitionist main actor in the events of his time. And I think that some of the events that Aogan mentioned, such as the incursions into Northern Ireland, are also to be understood as aspects of the struggle that Collins was engaged in to maintain the unity of the Republican Sinn Féin movement. He was trying at all costs, in the wake of the treaty, to keep everybody on board, to keep national unity. That's why he went into the electoral pact, which some people might think was somewhat undemocratic. He wanted to bed down the foundations of Irish independence and not to jeopardise them in the form of a civil war. And I would say that it's probably true that what happened later with my grandfather on the Boundary Commission and the like might not have taken the form it did if Collins had survived and if he hadn't been shot down. But those are things that we can't really spend too much time thinking about, because these are what ifs, and what ifs really don't serve too much purpose in my view. A point that I want to raise with you this evening is the recent publication of this book, Michael Collins' own story told to Hayden Talbot. And the interesting thing about this book is that it's on the website of this organisation. And I should tell you, by the way, I'm a life member of this organisation. And it's recently been reprinted, and I urge you to buy it if you're interested in Michael Collins, because this was an American journalist who befriended Collins in December 1921 and kept in contact with him until June of 1922, the formative years when all of these things were happening, the formative months when all of the Civil War events were gathering pace. And he shared with Hayden Talbot, in a way that he didn't actually do with anybody else, many intimate thoughts and many deep convictions about his view of Ireland, and impressed Talbot hugely. And what I want to ask you tonight is to consider one interesting topic, one chapter of the book. You'll find it on the website of this organisation, Michael Collins' opinion of Erskine Childers. Because this is another sad story of the Civil War. As we know, Erskine Childers was the man who skippered the Asgard in 1914, just as the First World War was about to break out. He brought in between 1,000 and 2,000 antiquated German rifles into Howth Harbour. There was fracas in Dublin, people were killed, and the volunteers were effectively armed. And as soon as there are a few things that you should consider about this. At the time that yacht came into Howth Harbour, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria had already been shot in Sarajevo, and the wheels of Europe were going towards war. And Erskine Childers, a Liberal Party supporter in England, was importing arms into Ireland from Germany, having purchased them in Hamburg, pretending they were scheduled to go to Mexico. And Childers goes to Hamburg with a man called Darrell Figgis, arranges for the purchase, comes back, rendezvous with a tug in the English Channel. They transfer the arms, he comes back on a circuitous course, sailing right through the home fleet, which at this stage was assembling for the outcome of the First World War, and delivers these arms in Howth. The amazing thing about Erskine Childers is that as soon as the war was started, the British Admiralty contacted Irish volunteers in Dublin looking for the present whereabouts of Erskine Childers. They wanted him to join up their war effort. And Erskine Childers did, and he became a naval intelligence officer in the British Navy during the First World War. He was seconded back to Count Plunkett's Irish Convention, which was an effort by the English to try and maintain political stability in Ireland in 1917, as its secretary, which is unusual for a serving officer to be seconded out of the services and back to function as a secretary of a British government promoted convention to try and unite the Irish in support of the war effort. He was critical of the 1916 leaders and wrote private letters indicating that they got their just deserts. After the war was over, he came back to Ireland and moved his favourable historians say by the views of his cousin Robert Barton, who was to be on the treaty delegation with him. He became absolutely convinced that total independence for Ireland and Irish unity should be on his agenda, and he became very close to De Valera. Now, one of the interesting things about this book is that you'll find that Collins and Griffith, and if you read more about Childers, you find Collins and Griffith got to dislike Childers very, very heavily. And we all know, or some of us know, that Griffith eventually called him that damned Englishman. And Collins, who had earlier had a reasonably good relationship and gave him the pistol, for possession of which he was executed in 1923 after Collins' death. Collins got to distrust him so massively that he wouldn't share the same quarters with him in the treaty negotiations in 1921. And he tells Hayden Talbot effectively, and the words are in the book, you'll see them on the site, that if he isn't an English spy, effectively he's doing as much damage as an English spy could do. And he says, I don't know which it is. And I sort of had all of this in the back of my mind, and one day I went in from my house in Carrick-on-Shannon and saw a book on the Hoth gun running and began to read it again. And then I asked myself, did Collins have a good reason to suspect Erskine Childers of being a spy? And Collins makes the point, he says, this man wrote a book in 1903 about a super spy who was a double agent. And then he runs through his record rather imperfectly. But one of the interesting things that Collins didn't know was that one of the men on the Asgard was an active British spy, an English naval commander called Gordon Shepherd, who had spent the last 3 years photographing German installations along the Heligoland, Frisian Islands in the North Sea. And therefore the question that arises is, really was Collins, had he good reason to suspect that the delivery of the Hoth guns was in fact something which was well known to some quarters in British intelligence? And this was a thought that was occurring to me, and I recently got a book called Erskine Childers' Dangerous Waters, and there's an interesting passage in it where the author concludes at the end that in reality it was quite likely that somebody, and he says it wasn't Erskine Childers, but somebody had tipped off the British to the importation of the arms to Hoth, but it was allowed to go through for political purposes. And I won't detain you long, but I will ask you to look at two quotations about Erskine Childers. When he was arrested and before he was executed, Winston Spencer Churchill, who, by the way, admired Collins, said the following about him: I have seen with satisfaction that the mischief-making, murderous renegade Erskine Childers has been captured. No man has done more harm or shown more genuine malice or endeavoured to bring a greater curse upon the common people of Ireland than this strange being, actuated by a deadly and malignant hatred for the land of his birth. Such as he is, may all who hate us be. Now that's Winston, that is the English Home Secretary talking about Erskine Childers. But curiously, and this is the weird thing, 3 years later, Churchill had revised his views. And he wrote of him, another man of distinction, ability and courage fell a victim. This is about the Irish Civil War. Erskine Childers, author of The Riddle of the Sands, who had shown daring and ardour against the German and in the Cuxhaven raid, had espoused the Irish cause with even more than Irish irreconcilability. He too was shot for rebellion against the Free State, and he called him a great statesman and a patriot. Now, Churchill was partial to a brandy, I suppose. And it is possible that Churchill held both views genuinely. I think it's true. I think he really was delighted that the Free State forces had arrested Childers, and those comments are genuine. But I wonder whether his revised view was that somebody had tapped him on the shoulder and said, maybe he wasn't as anti-British as you have always thought. Now, the last thing I want to say to you is this. Another book which many of you have probably seen is Michael Collins's Intelligence War by Michael Foy, who is the professor of history at Method Ecology in Belfast. And it's a fascinating account of Michael Collins's determination to stay ahead of British intelligence, everything he did to infiltrate it, the methods he used, sometimes very tough and sometimes murderous, to eliminate agents and to enforce security in the interests of the IRA. But Mr. Foy, at the end of his book, suggests that Mrs. Childers, Molly Childers, Erskine Childers' wife, could be a British spy. And he produces 2 documents from the House of Lords archives in support of this thesis. And he says that one of them seems to be virulently hostile to the Republican movement, which he claims Molly secretly was. And he then says that references in these documents to Bob and to the information the author, who was clearly a woman with an American turn of phrase, was using, suggests strongly this was Molly Childers. Now, I've researched this in my own little way, and I've come to the conclusion that it wasn't Molly Childers, but in all probability it was Molly's mother, who lived with Erskine and Molly Childers in Bushy Park Road in Rathgar, just a stone's throw from where I live. And she was virulently anti-IRA, and everything fits into her being the author of these documents. She wasn't a super spy or a Mata Hari. She wasn't a very good agent, but she was supplying, somebody, and I think it was she, was supplying information which is now to be found in the archives of the House of Lords. Why has it come to light? Because David Lloyd George, the man who signed the treaty with Michael Collins, had a mistress called Frances Stevenson. And you'll be glad to know that he used to give her little tidbits of information to keep her amused. And the funny thing is that although they were having a long-standing affair and he fathered a child by her, on the 29th of, I think it's the 6th, 1921, he said, "My dear Miss Stevenson," how formal he was, "this really comes straight from the cow." And he goes on to say, to describe the material, and he says, "I should very much like a talk with you, if you can spare the time." This is to his mistress. "Can you lunch on Tuesday next, the 5th? Yours sincerely, Lloyd George." But in any event, I do think, and this is what I want to finish on, it isn't proven that Erskine Childers was a spy. And I say this in standing in the constituency of Cavan, which he once represented. And I'm talking about political representative in Cavan, I always like to pay tribute to another great Cavan man, John Patrick Wilson, who taught me Latin and Greek when I was at school. And it was a great man and a very decent man, and also happened to be a Taoiseach for a brief period, like yours truly. But I do say this, that I think the jury must be out about whether the British knew about the Asgard importation of arms. I think that the arguments that Collins made for the possibility that Childers, and he imparted this information in confidence to Hayden Talbot, the American journalist, who felt that when Collins was shot, he was released from his duty of confidence to Collins in relation to this, that the views he expressed had some basis, at least for raising a suspicion. And that therefore, some of the arguments that are put this way and that as to whether Collins and Griffith were just bitter, bigoted, anti-English people in relation to Childers, or whether they had some grounds for believing that he could be a person who was bent on the destruction of their movement, it has at least some element of credibility to it. And I thought that in view of, the fact that we are now coming into a decade of centenaries of the Ulster Covenant, which, as I have described, was the founding document of Irish independence because it brought the gun into Irish politics unceremoniously. A centenary next year, or this year, of the Great Strike in Dublin. Centenaries of the foundation of the Volunteers in Dublin in November of this year, and up to 1916, and it'll go on until 1922 or 1923. I believe that the Irish people are now willing to look at their history in a very different way from the way they were willing to look at it, say, in 1966 on the 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising. And I believe that we want to know about the complexity of our history from the Bruton Redmondist point of view to the sacrifice that all those people made in the Great War and the Battle of the Somme, to the different sides in the Civil War, not on the basis of proving who was right, but in fact on the basis of trying to understand who we are. And my last point is this. Aogan was depicting the pogroms in Belfast, the deaths that took place, the bloodshed which was narrowly avoided here and there on the border. We have one great act of Republican reconciliation still to go, and that is to make the green and orange panels on our tricolour really stand for reconciliation between those two traditions. That act of reconciliation and that process of reconciliation is going to be a very, very difficult one indeed. But I think this society on this side of the border, just as the northern part of our country is changing, so are we. And I think we see our history as a lot more complex and a lot more worthy of study and a lot more worthy of admiration for a generation of people who made immense sacrifices for us. And in saying that, I also believe that the term republic is something which belongs to all of us. Michael Collins, Fine Gaelers, Fianna Fáilers, Labour, whoever, Progressive Democrats, whoever, are entitled to say we are Republicans. Nobody has a monopoly on that word. And until green and orange are reconciled, the Republic is unfinished business. And those who espouse the term republicanism in pursuit of division, and who would have inflamed on this island at any time in any decade over the last 70 or 90 years, a terrible civil war in which orange would take on green and vice versa. They don't understand the term. Michael Collins, in his youthful passion, came to the brink that Aogan spoke about and stood back because he could see that that flag did not mean civil war on this island. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Michael, for a very original and fascinating take on your topic, which I think has left us all with a great deal of food for thought. I think those of us of any political tradition, and of none in the room, can be reinvigorated by your call to arms for a new patriotism and a new way of going about our business in this new century. Now, as I said before, I don't want our guests from Dublin on a 2-day trip to Baileborough. So I'm going to have a very tight question and answer session, and it is not an opportunity to make a speech. It is an opportunity to ask questions or make brief observations. So can I have volunteers? And the lighting actually is not hectic. I don't know if any of the hotel staff can help in that respect. And I don't have my driving glasses on, so a lot of you at the back of the room are a bit of a blur, but have we a volunteer? I do see, yeah, Dermot McMonigal. Has Ozzy the roving mic? Ozzy, this man over here on my left, Dermot McMonigal, who I believe is writing a book. Yeah, Dermot is there. No, Dermot is there with his hand up, Ozzy. Yeah. Now, Dermot.
Thank you very much, everybody. I think everybody enjoyed the evening, and nobody can disagree that Michael Collins has to be commemorated in 1922. But where do we leave Arthur Griffith in the equation? Because I believe, and historians will believe, Griffith made Collins, Collins made Griffith. They have always stood together in our history. Can we not have the two of them together on a plinth in Leinster House? Thank you.
Does anyone want to volunteer to take on that question?
But can I just simply point
Do you want to come up here, Michael, again? Or?
there is a big monument on the lawn of Leinster House, and the obelisk, and it is devoted to the memory of Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins. And all I would say is that, and I listened to what was said earlier about a statue, but I also believe that what this society does in terms of promoting understanding and getting kids to learn about these things can be just as important as plinths, monuments and statues. I really think that Michael Collins is a person who, and I'm talking now about my sons, they believe he is one of our greatest people, and to some extent the isolation in which he was for 70 years, I suppose, it's gone now. They regard him as the hero of Irish freedom. Whether it was fair or not, the Michael Collins film, has in fact swung the hearts of young Ireland totally towards Michael Collins. I mean, it was slightly unfair to Dev because it suggested that he was down there looking down the wrong side end of a sniper scope, but I mean, that is not true. But nonetheless, I genuinely believe that most young people in Ireland now, they sort of, in the same sense that the Che Guevara poster was on the bedroom walls 20 years ago, Michael Collins's picture is something which means something. It's an iconic picture in their hearts now, more than any of the leaders. But to go back to Arthur Griffith, he does deserve to be honoured, and he deserves a few programmes on television, and he deserves the whole Sinn Féin movement, and his thoughts about that deserve to be brought to the public's attention, because they have no idea really. I think most people have no idea about what kind of man he really was, and he was very generous to Collins in saying that he was the greatest, but Collins was equally generous to him. So I think that Griffith has been airbrushed out a bit and deserves to come back centre stage.
Thank you very much, Michael. Have we another question, or have we another question? This is unusual. Obviously, you'll have to. I don't know if you say your name in case I don't recognise you. Yeah. Have you your hand up or? Yeah. And maybe tell us who you'd like to answer a question, please, as well.
Can I ask Nora, what was Collins's family view of Dev after the Civil War?
Hang on.
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much. Again, my mother and my aunts and my uncles, who were all the children that had been burnt out of their home, they didn't really talk about De Valera at that time. See, as Michael McDowell says, before the split, as it were, De Valera, they mightn't have been two of a kind, but they got on and they admired each other at a certain level. So I suppose it's us, the slightly younger generation, who carry the seeds of, you know, not liking De Valera. And as many people as stop me and say how much they admired Collins will say the complete opposite about De Valera and how their mother used to spit at the picture or whatever. And that was the sadness of a civil war, because two people who were working to bring about independence in Ireland end up fighting. And then, of course, there's a kind of annoyance that because De Valera lived for so long and was president for so long, was Taoiseach and president for so long, that led to Collins being submerged into, you know, out of the memories of people. And so there would be still a certain amount of bitterness there. But I think the situation has moved on. As Michael McDowell said, it's time now for us all to revisit what all these people did and try and remove some of that kind of maybe bitterness. And as the older generation sadly pass on, maybe the next generations won't feel quite the same bitterness. I do feel that.
Thank you very much, Nora. Have you another question? I'll take two or three more. I see a hand. Again, I can't make out who the hand belongs to, but there's a hand down there, Ozzy. Keep your hand up so Ozzy can see you. Yeah, thank you. And if you can say who you are and who you want to answer the question, please. We should have cloned Ozzy and had one on each side.
Thank you, John O'Connell.
Oh, John O'Connell.
And I'd like to ask European Councillor Jim Higgins, what is the understanding of Michael Collins in Europe? How is he seen in Europe? Thank you.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I mean, there would be very little reference to Michael Collins in Europe. Was that John, is it? Yeah. That asked the question. But I think the legacy of Collins in terms of trying to what Michael aspired to, and that is uniting the green and the gold, is happening. It's amazing the relationship that has been built up between first of all, the MEPs from the Republic, and secondly, the MEPs from the North. We have a borderless country now. You know, the situation is that we don't have any customs or any exercise. We don't have a police presence on the border. And, for example, I today was in Sligo doing a cross-border conference in relation to cross-border funding, the interactive agencies and so on. And who was chairing the conference that I was actually speaking at? Martina Anderson. Last week I facilitated, because I'm in charge of exhibitions in the European Parliament, I facilitated Diane Dodds in relation to putting on an exhibition to commemorate the Irish presidency. When the European issues have been discussed in terms of our presidency, and ministers are coming back and over all of the time because we have the presidency from the 1st of January until the 30th of June. The likes of Diane Dodds, the likes of Jim Nicholson come in and they meet with our Minister for Agriculture, Simon Coveney, in relation to fishery issues. So there's a whole commonality and a whole sense of common purpose that has now arisen. And I think that's the kind of legacy that Michael was talking about that we would like to see realised and develop more. So things are happening, and there's no doubt about it. We have come a long, long way, and the tragedy of it is that Michael Collins wasn't here, first of all, to make it happen and to see to see it happen. So, John, there is a huge merging of identities. And you know, we have the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and we know what that is doing in terms of the long-term aspirations of our Republican Brotherhood in the north of Ireland. So the main thing is that the guns are silent, and that's what Collins always wanted. He never wanted to be in the blood that the Civil War was, and the subsequent mayhem that was inflicted on their brethren both north and south, but particularly in the north, over the mayhem of the 20 years of the Troubles.
Could I just add to that a little anecdote to show the change? I remember when Ivan Yates was Minister for Agriculture, and Ian Paisley wanted to meet him. We were in the presidency, and he wanted to meet him about difficulties in the north and the combined difficulties north and south of the border. But he went to great pains to say, I am meeting the President of the Agricultural Council. I'm not meeting him as Minister. And when he would greet him, he would say, hello, President, and he wouldn't say, hello, Minister. And Ivan used to get a great kick out of that, because, as you know, Ivan was Church of Ireland. But like, that was back in 1996. And now there's no problem with people of north and south sitting down to talk to ministers here or ministers in the north. So there has been a good change in that.
Thank you, Nora. Jim was asked a question there. Jim is not here for decoration. He does have a role to play near the end of proceedings, which is quite special, just in case people are wondering why he hasn't spoken thus far. And there's nothing wrong with him as decoration. That's not impugning how he looks or anything. Now, one or two brief questions, because we do have a few other things. You all got a ticket, and I know there are people from Meath and Monaghan here, and we have to debunk any myths about how mean we are in Cavan, and there's quite a generous raffle which will require a bit of time. You could be getting your tickets ready, actually. Now, one or two brief questions. If they're there, if they're not, we'll keep moving. Okay, I think we will move on. Nora's here like a producer in my ear. Oh, is there one left? We'll do one more, and that is it. We'll go on to our raffle then. Just say who you are and the question, who you'd like to answer it.
James Riley.
Hello, James.
Is it true that the late Michael Collins never carried a gun? Very seldom.
Who'd like to take on to answer that one?
That is hard to prove, because there's nobody here at this meeting or anywhere that can tell us that. I'd be inclined to think that might be a little bit of a story.
I thought so myself, by the way.
I see Gerry O'Connell just wants to contribute.
I think it's fairly well documented that he carried a Webley service revolver throughout the Civil War, and there's a number of photographs of him. In August 1922, carrying a sidearm. Now, I just want to take one small opportunity just about the Griffith question, Sean, if I may, just very briefly. I think Griffith is a very tragic figure in all of this, extremely tragic. And the man died of a brain hemorrhage on the 12th of August 1922. He died of exhaustion, effectively. Arthur Griffith gave his life for Ireland. He is one of the casualties of the Irish struggle, of the Irish Civil War. And I'm struck by the fact that there's very little fanfare about the manner of Griffith's death. Griffith died of a brain hemorrhage caused by a lot of contemporary sources at the time said that it was brought on by exhaustion and gross fatigue. And President Franklin Roosevelt, the great American president, also died of a brain hemorrhage in 1945. And the day after President Roosevelt died, the New York Times, as they did every day throughout World War II, carried the list of Allied casualties, US Allied casualties that were killed in the Second World War the previous day. And top of the list on that day was FDR Roosevelt, rank Commander-in-Chief. And I do feel it's not just because we're in Cavan and Mudjabon is out the road, that Griffith's death and Griffith's sacrifice really deserves to be remembered as well. And there's just a sort of a little, I'm struck by that as well. And within 10 days, both Collins and Griffith were dead. And within 7 days after Griffith's funeral, Collins was dead. And the famous footage of Griffith's funeral, with Collins and Mulcahy and O'Sullivan and the Officer Corps of the National Army all gathered together on film pretty much for the last time, was at Griffith's funeral.
We'll proceed to the raffle. Now, what have we left to do? I want to welcome another very good friend of mine, the MEP for Ireland North West, one of the largest European constituencies in the European Union. It takes in the province of Ulster, it takes in the province of Leinster, it takes in all of Connaught, and it takes in Clare and Munster. It is a massive challenge to represent. I am sure he will tell us it's a massive honour and privilege to represent it. A man who has been Government Chief Whip, who has been a Senator and TD, who was a teacher, who was a champion award-winning debater for Ireland, Jim Higgins. Jim has one or two little anecdotes to tell you about Collins and Mayo and family remembrances of Collins, and then he's a special treat. Some of you know what it is, or maybe I said it already and I've forgotten, but he has a very special treat for you then after that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sean. I think I echo and re-echo all of your sentiments when I say to you, Councillor Sean McKiernan, well done. This was an evening that had style and had substance. And when you look at the panel and when you listen to the panel, I mean, Michael's presentation in relation to the national loan, the in-depth analysis he did of that was absolutely fascinating. Gerry O'Connell was absolutely right in his introduction. We have kept Michael Collins under the radar for far too long. Ireland, and particularly Fine Gael, have not claimed the legacy of Collins until the last 10 or 15 years. And I want to pay tribute to the Collins 22 Society, to Bill down there, to Jim, to Gerry, and the people who are spreading this particular movement throughout the country. I was at a similar gathering in Galway a number of weeks ago. Nora was at it, equally well attended. In relation to the presentation by Nora, her particular perspective was absolutely fascinating in relation to the family and the family aspect of it. In relation to Aogan, it's great to see one of our own taking a paramount position in Cumann Lugh Gael. Too often we have not managed to get some of our own people into primary positions. And he, as a former president of the Ulster Council, follows in the footsteps of a man who carried that particular mantle, and I see his daughter down there, Madeleine Argue, the late great Senator Andy O'Brien. In relation to Michael McDowell, I mean, Michael's presentation was absolutely riveting, and I loved all of the conspiracy theories and the nice little bits of spice here and there in order to make it all that little bit more interesting. And to Sean, again, well done, and to the musicians behind us. You know, the whole thing was done with such panache. Well done indeed. Can I just say that I had the greatest honour of my life, I think, in being asked a number of years ago when I got a phone call from Frank Metcalf in Cork to actually do the oration in Baile Baileborough. And as I was delivering my few words, I could not get my father out of my head because he died when we were relatively young. But if ever there was an advocate and passionate supporter and follower of Michael Collins, it was my late father. And it goes back to the year 1919 when he was 10 years of age, and his uncle was first Cumann and Nail chairman of Mayo County Council. He saw Collins on a platform. My uncle was chairing the particular meeting at the time. It was a mass gathering. And he was absolutely hypnotised, fascinated and captivated by the sheer power and presence of Collins, his magnetism and his oratory. And one of the sad things about the Collins legacy is that we don't actually have a recording or many recordings, because I believe that he came in the same vein as the great liberator himself, Daniel O'Connell. So I went to St. Giles College June We didn't have the same kind of salubrious surroundings as Gonzaga, Michael, but it was satisfactory. 18 priests, 300 captives who got home only at Easter and Christmas and for the summer holidays. My father was a native Irish speaker, and we were, to be quite honest with you, half-starved. By virtue of the fact that we lived only 30 minutes in Tuam every Sunday, my mother would bring up rashers and sausages, and Clonakilty black pudding hadn't reached Ballyhonus at that stage. We'd eat at the side of the cathedral, and I distinctly remember that the very first essay I got as Gaeilge was on Far Bawóchunker Síl na HÉireann na Cíge Bliana Nús, the man with the most influence on the life of Ireland for the last 50 years. So I said to my dad, who will I write about? And he said, who the hell else would you write about but Michael Collins? And he wrote it for me. And I transcribed it. And when he came up the following Sunday, he said, how did the essay go? I said, an absolute disaster. What do you mean? I went into the study hall, because I had to go to the study hall, because he insisted in getting his hands on it. And it was all red marks. And it wasn't that the grammar or the syntax were wrong. The facts were wrong. Right throughout, he had decided he was going to put his own version of what my father told me. And the last line in the essay was, Na ufas an scéles, the terrible thing, Teresha Seal Bra Calwer, after his wonderful brave life, got far as a here fain a warrior, that was someone from his own country who killed him. And that particular comment was pointed in a particular direction. And of course that was corrected, and he said, Me Carth, Far Darabana McPeak a warrior, man by the name of McPeak, they killed him. By God, did I suffer for that particular essay. So much so that my life was basically a horror for the next 2 years because he taught us both Irish and Greek. But when I was addressing the congregation on that wet day in Baile Baileborough, I brought to the attention of people who were actually there that there is a very strong Mayo connection with the Collins family. Because the late Kitty Collins, Michael Collins' sister, was the principal teacher in Bahola National School. And when you read all about her, it's fascinating. She had so many of the Collins characteristics. But she also was a beautiful singer and trained the local choir, and for first communions and for confirmations, very often out of her own pocket, clad the less well-to-do. And she was married to a man by the name of Joe Sheridan. And Joe Sheridan was a brother of the late Martin Sheridan, who won 6 Olympic medals, sadly wearing the singlet of the United States. But the Olympic Games in 1928 were held in Shepherd's Bush in London. And Martin Sheridan was asked to carry the Star-Spangled Banner. And when he was passing the King's podium, he refused to doff the flag. So that there was republicanism running through the veins of the Sheridans as well as the Collins family. And when I was doing a bit of research for the Baile Baileborough speech, I went to the house that Kitty and Joe Sheridan lived in. And a man by the name of Roach has the house at present. And Tom Roach brought me into a little museum that he has of his own beside the house. And there, in the memorabilia that he had gathered from the Sheridan and from the Collins family, were 2 books that were written prior to 1798 by Theobald Wolfe Tone, and both of which were actually autographed by Michael Collins in Collins' own inimitable writing, because he always signed himself Micheál Ó Colán. So that's the Mayo connection, and a lot of people didn't know about it. And every time I passed Bahola Graveyard, I basically doffed my cap, I basically blessed myself, and I said, thanks be to God for the legacy that the Collins family gave this country. And when I finished in Baile Baileborough, even though it was wet, people hung on to hear the following. The curlew sat silent in the long dark grass, and as he looked down on the roadway that winds its way through Baile Baileborough, and the young men running forwards and backwards, bobbing and weaving and cursing and ducking as the bullets rained down on them from the hillside opposite. Suddenly the firing stopped, and a deathly silence hung over the valley. A hurried whispered act of contrition, and the firing breaks out again, and the curlew takes to flight. And as he flies out over the dark, bare hills of West Cork, he would tell the world that the big fellow has fallen and that Michael is gone. On a far off autumn day, cold young men in anger lay on the roadside near a hill where flowers grow. So much hate for one so young, who was right and who was wrong. Though 1,000 years may pass, we'll never know. Candles dripping blood we placed beside your shoulder, rosary beads like teardrops on your fingers, friends and comrades standing by. In their grief they wondered why, Michael, in their hour of need you had to go. And when evening twilight came, gently fell the August rain, but you lay still and silent on the ground, as we held our head in prayer. In our sorrow and despair, we wondered, was it friend or foe that shot you down? Candles dripping blood we placed beside your shoulder, rosary beads like teardrops on your fingers, friends and comrades standing by. In their grief they wonder why, Michael, in their hour of need you had to go. Now the flame that you held high, as you cried out to the sky, to end this senseless killing and this shame, has now passed to other hands, and is carried through the land by some not even fit to speak your name. Candles dripping blood we placed beside your shoulder, rosary beads like teardrops on your fingers, friends and comrades standing by. In their grief they wonder why, Michael, in their hour of need you had to go. Michael, in our hour of need, why did you go? Thank you very much.
He was work really for Mayo, I think. Well done, Jim. Can I ask my area colleague John O'Hare to step forward? He's going to do a brief vote of thanks to the guest speakers. And he's also going to encourage you to set up a Collins Society in Cavan. And it will be brief because we have some short presentations and then the national anthem. Thank you, John.
Thank you, colleague Councillor Sean. It's a great honour and privilege for me to propose a vote of thanks, and I would like to begin by welcoming you all to Baileborough tonight and to thank you all sincerely for coming. I think that you will all agree that this was an excellent celebration of the life of Ireland's greatest hero, General Michael Collins. I would like to pay tribute to Councillor Sean McKiernan and the Collins 22 Society for organising tonight's event. I would like to thank our excellent speakers, Gerry O'Connell, Nora Owen, Michael Doran, Aogan Farrell, Michael McDowell and Jim Higgins. Thank you all for your outstanding contributions. I hope that this will not be a once-off occasion, but the start of a new tradition and a new way in which to keep the memory of the great Michael Collins and the great man's name alive. For many young people, as Michael McDowell said here tonight, Michael Collins was their hero. I was no exception, and tonight I'm proud to stand here and say that Michael Collins is and always will be my hero. At last year's Baile Baileborough, on Taoiseach Kenny said this of Michael Collins, and I quote, "He was a young man with a young man's hopes and dreams, but with the destiny of a nation on his shoulders." This was true. Though his life was short, Michael managed to teach us many things. What it means to be truly courageous, what it means to be honourable, loyal and true. He strongly believed that Ireland and our people could be a shining light in a dark world. But I think the greatest thing that General Michael Collins taught us is what it means to really love our country, to love your fellow man. Give us the future, give us back our country, to live in, to grow in, to love. Thank you.
John, thank you very much. I deeply appreciate you proposing the vote of thanks here tonight. And if we are to follow John's hope and desire that the night does not end here, I encourage you to take the application forms for membership of the Collins 22 Society, which are going to be given out at the back as you leave. You can fill them up in your own time and send them back in your own time. If you want to fill them up tonight, you may do so, but you can do them in your own time. Now, what is left to do? We have presentations. Can I invite up Pat Gaffney, the chairman of the Fine Gael branch in Baileborough, to present a beautiful piece of slate with an image of Michael McDowell's grandfather, Owen McNeill, on it. And again, this is given to us by a good friend of ours in Galway, Tomas, whose second name is escaping me. O'Coin, thank you. Thank you, prompters. So I'll ask Pat to present that. If Leslie McCaig is in the audience, I know he was coming. I can't see a thing here. Oh, I see Leslie. Yeah. Pat, look towards the camera, Pat. Yeah. I'd invite now Leslie McCaig, who has written a book. Baileborough is now, I think, 402 years old at this stage, or maybe 403. To commemorate its 400 years, Leslie McCaig collected a wonderful pictorial history of the town, and I'd invite him to present that to Michael as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leslie. Can I invite up Miss Mary Frances Riley to present a bunch of flowers to Nora Owen. I hope you like flowers, Nora, and you're not allergic to them or anything. And can I, Mary Carolyn, when this is going on beside me, I'll keep talking. Mary Carolyn has written a lovely book about growing up in the 1950s in East Cavan in Kingscourt, and I would invite her, she's come here tonight, I'd invite her to present her book to Nora also. So, and then I want to invite Paddy Martin to present Leslie's book to Nora as well. They'll need a trailer going home. I'm sure there's someone who'll lend them one.
Thank you very much.
Now, I think we're, yeah, and Paddy is presenting Leslie's book to Baileborough Victorian Pass. I'm sure there's copies available, Leslie? Yeah, there are.
Thank you.
Can I invite up Councillor Vincent McCall from Coteel to present a copy of the book to Gerry O'Connell? And then there was mention made a couple of times this evening to General Sean McKiernan, and there is a nephew-in-law of General McKiernan here in the audience, my party colleague in Coteel, Aogan Farrell, and I would invite him to present a copy of Leslie's book to Michael Doran in appreciation of him being here tonight. Now, we're nearly there, everyone. We're nearly there. Can I invite my colleague David Blake to come forward and present a copy of Leslie's book to Aogan Farrell?
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Aogan. Can I invite Madeleine Argue, the chairwoman of Cavan BEC, to present to Jim Higgins?
Okay, look up on the boat. Is it good? Good. Thanks.
Thank you again, Jim and Madeleine. I want to say some brief thanks. I want to thank the panel again. They were splendid. I want to thank our sound people. I want to thank Ozzy, Austin MacDonald, to be more forward, and Willie Townley and Thomas Townley. It's worth noting we talked about bridging the gap between the orange and the green on our national flag. The podium that I am holding and that everyone else has held tonight comes from Brakey Orange Hall, about a mile away, and it is the podium when the first President of Ireland to officially visit an Orange Hall was Mary McAleese, and that happened in Brakey, out the road a mile away, 2 years ago, and this is the same podium that she used on that historic occasion. So maybe that was infusing Michael McDowell as he made that pronouncement and made that aspiration, but quite apt to use this podium to do it on. So I want to thank the sound people. I want to thank again our musicians Mary and Sharon, and I don't think they really got to escape from the stage, so I apologise for that. Probably dying for 7-Up or some other type of mineral. I want to thank the doorman, Colin Colgan and Pat Gaffney and Paddy Martin and Councillor John O'Hare as well. I want to thank them. Obviously the hotel for their kindness and courtesy. I want now, and please indulge me because this is important, people who give of their time on a voluntary basis should be acknowledged. There are two men involved in this organisation at national level, Bill Martin and Jim Nevin. Bill Martin is from a long way away, he's from Tipperary as the song goes, it's a long way to Tipperary. Jim Nevin is slightly more local and almost one of our own, he's only 10 miles away in Minalty. And I want to salute the fact that they brought together this panel of speakers and gave me the opportunity to host it here in Baileborough tonight and give you as a people in this community and surrounding areas the chance to hear what that panel had to say. And they provided great support and encouragement. I'm not always the most easy person to deal with, and they did provide great support and encouragement and kept the project on the straight and narrow, and I think their guidance and support, the fruits of that are evident tonight. I want to give those two men here in the front row a big round of applause. Stand up, gentlemen. Stand up. Stand up. Stand up. finally, and thanks are important, and I know my parents are there, and I suddenly remembered I probably should mention them, but I'll get it, there'll be no breakfast tomorrow. But anyway, but I want to acknowledge them obviously, but I do in particular, and I am, again, I'll probably not be talked to now for a week over this, I want to acknowledge the fact that for the last year and a half, since I was chairman of the council, I had a great guy working for me as an intern, above and beyond the call of duty, called Danny Hanley, who is now sitting modestly at the back. He maybe detected I was going to do something. He's now sitting modestly at the back. He was up the front for a lot of the night. He's helped me out in the background a lot for the last year and a half, and he's now leaving me for very positive reasons. On Monday morning next, he will be the new secretarial assistant to Peter Matthews TD in Dublin South. I want to wish him the very best of luck. So that's it. That's it. I now invite, since he was so good, we know he's good at singing now, can I invite Jim Higgins to sing our national anthem?
Shinna fina fall, a coffee allegeren, wind or slew, or glimmer on coon, fair void vesir, shan cheer or shincher fasta, ni Fenchir on Noventa, an openings a barnabwe, legon shred on boss no se, legon shred, melavan a bele, shoy khali
Thank you all for coming and safe home.